Welcome to the Pinnacle Leaders Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Randall Langley, President of Christian Life School of Theology Global. The opportunity to share biblical wisdom with kingdom-minded leaders in the areas of lordship, leadership, and lifestyle led me to start this show. My desire is that through this podcast, you'll be equipped with relevant tools to maximize your leadership potential and reach the pinnacle of your calling. You'll hear from myself and many other successful leaders who are recognized experts on these topics and many others. We hope you enjoy this show.
Welcome to the show, everyone. Thank you for tuning in. I'm Jonathan Langley, today's guest host. Just recently, Christian Life School of Theology Global honored graduates from all over the world in our 2021 commencement ceremony. Addressing the graduates was Dr. Kevin Baird, a previous podcast guest you might remember. He's a CLSTG faculty member and the director of the Florida Capital Project. In his address, he gave us 3 reasons to be hopeful in today's cultural climate, which is progressively pitting itself against the church and biblical values. So it's my pleasure to share this encouraging message with you.
Now, my current ministry assignment is to reach out to Florida pastors to connect them with their civic leaders. Sometimes I'm asked the question as to why. Well, the short answer is that the church, with pastors as well as Christian leaders, are the linchpin to whether this culture is renewed or whether it continues to deteriorate. Now, you may ask, how can you say that? Well, I say that because Jesus first said it when he declared that his people were to be the salt of the earth and they were the light of the world. So if there's anything that's worth preserving, if there's anything good, anything true, anything beautiful, if it's to be preserved, it's on us. And likewise, if it's all falling apart, that's on us too. But the sobering point is that the church has abdicated in many ways its salt and light role. There are, according to stats, over 25 million unregistered Christians who simply sit out elections no matter what their viewpoint may be. Baird tells us in recent studies that only 6% of church attenders hold a consistent biblical worldview. In fact, that number drops to 4% when we take it to the next generation. The connection between our faith and the scriptural mandate of influence is evaporating. In fact, we're beginning to cement the unbiblical notion that there is somehow a divide between that which is sacred and that which is secular, when the psalmist said that the earth is the Lord's and all that it contains. I'm remembered of Jesus' story concerning the man who was delivered from a demon in Matthew 12:43. And he taught us that when an unclean spirit leaves a man, it seeks another place to dwell. In fact, according to his story, the man was cleansed, his house was put in order. But the demon came back and brought 7 of his friends with him, 7 more wicked, Jesus said. Now, the point of the story, and there could be several of them, but I take one as this, that there's a dangerous implication in creating vacuums and ceding this ground to the devil. Every vacuum will be filled with something, either righteousness or evil. You see, there's no such thing as neutral. This vacuum will be filled. And if the church and Christian leaders decide to allow vacuums to exist in whatever arena it may be in culture, then it should not surprise us when the enemy sweeps in and things become 7 times worse than they were years ago. Now, I understand that the present American culture feels on edge. We all feel on edge these days. We all are riding this roller coaster ride of a pandemic. Our politics has put us in an upheaval. There are anger and wounds and scars as we reflect upon our historical sins as a nation. Our trust levels with media, institutions, and bureaucracies are at an all-time low. And so you and I were born into an era that is just like this. We may not have asked for it, but here we are. And they're challenging days, no doubt. I'm reminded of the story of the Apollo 13 explosion, where we nearly lost 3 of our astronauts in space. Mission Control was understandably in a panic as they assessed the situation and problems, knowing that it looked impossible. Chris Kraft was the NASA administrator at the time, and he was reported to have said that this could be the worst disaster in NASA history. Gene Kranz, the NASA flight director, responded. He said, "With all due respect, I believe this could be our finest hour." So in much the same way, many are predicting that this may be the worst season for church adversity, apathy, and maybe our time has come and gone. And yet I believe that despite the challenges and the realities we face, I am convinced that this moment could be the church's finest hour, and your leadership is being called upon to enter into the hour into which you were born. So I want to just share with you in these remaining moments and remind you as leaders of why we might have hope. Romans 8:28 says that God causes, that's what it says in the literal Greek, God causes all things to work together for good to those that love him and are called according to his purpose. There are three words I want to leave with you today that I want you to remember as you take your leadership into the future. The first word, and it has helped me walk through these incredibly challenging days, the first word is providence. Providence simply means that God is sovereign and he is large and he is in charge. The word simply means that history and the present are not simply the accumulation of capricious or arbitrary events. That you and I are not groping around by blind chance, tripping into what we hope may be good decisions. There's a God that's orchestrating his will in the earth, causing events to work for his purposes. The Bible says the steps of a righteous man are ordered, and that gives me great hope. You know, recently, Prince Philip of the royal family passed away, and you know, it's amazing to me how Americans love the British royals. It's like we've come full circle. You know, there was a time in our history we were trying to get away from British royalty, and now it seems we're enamored with British royalty. Now, I have a theory as to why that is. I believe that we are enamored with them because they're ceremonial, they really are impotent and powerless, so we can project upon them any storybook image that we might like to inflict upon them. We can dream whatever we want to dream about them. They are figurehead royalty, so it's a storybook in most of our minds. And when it comes to royalty, oftentimes that's what we default to. But I want to remind you, when it comes to Jesus, he is no storybook king, nor is he a figurehead king. In fact, he is a real king. His authority is rule, and despite at times our efforts to force upon him these storybook imaginations and make him into something he's not, he is large, he is in charge, and he is in control. Our founders of this nation knew that it was God as they were approaching a battle with a great superpower. It was God who would be in charge of the war. It was God who would move the heart of the king. It was God who sets up one and pulls down another. It was God who empowers people to prosper, who determines where men live, who controls the weather, who establishes governments, who creates the boundaries of nations. This was ingrained into the American psyche, and we just simply need to be reminded of it again, that God is providential, he is sovereign, he is in charge, and it fills me with hope as I go into this incredibly challenging time period as a leader that providence is at work for me. The second word is paradox. Paradox simply means that God's ways are not my ways. Much like irony, it's when something looks or acts or is spoken that seems almost absurd. But when you investigate it, you find it to be true. The kingdom of God runs on paradox. I just want to remind you that your leadership will run on paradox. If you try to save your life, you'll lose it. But if you lose your life for the sake of the gospel, you'll save it. Jesus said words like, if you die, you live. If you give up, you get in. That the servant will be the greatest, the first will be last, and the last will be first. He will exalt the humble, but he will debase the proud. He will choose the foolish things to shame the wise, the weak things the mighty, the base things and the despised things to bring to nothing the things that are. This is how leadership works. He pulls kings out of sheep fields like David. Like Joseph, he pulls economists out of prisons to stand next to pharaohs. He puts saviors into stables. He plucks world changers off fishing boats. The list is endless as to the paradoxical nature of his kingdom. Now, why does God choose paradox? 2 reasons. It slays our pride and it challenges our pragmatism. We need to be reminded at times as leaders, we're not always as smart as we think we are. And so this is good news for us, that God is not only large and in charge, providential, but there's also a paradox to his ways. And any setback you may face may actually be a set up for an opportunity. Your problem may actually be an open door. So remember providence, remember paradox, but thirdly, perseverance. God empowers you to press forward, to persevere. And I just want to end by asking a question. How do you view the future? Do you see it as a foregone conclusion that everything's collapsing, there's no reason for hope, much less work at trying to bring about change? Do we capitulate to the winds of challenge and adversity? Or do we look to the future realizing that all things work together for good to those that love him and are called according to his purposes? You see, the answer to that question will strike to the heart of your motivation. I believe the gospel ultimately prevails. I believe that gross darkness is the best environment for the church and her leaders to arise and shine. I believe that the real church is unstoppable because our God cannot be stopped. I believe the latter house is greater than the former one. I believe Jesus will get his way. I believe as amazing as the book of Acts may be, it was only the starting point of something far greater. It doesn't matter what the world says the scoreboard is today. I know Jesus wins in the end, so I persevere. God enables and empowers me to persevere. We persevere in prayer. We persevere in proclamation. We persevere in participation. Jesus said it best when he looked at his disciples and he said, "You occupy or you do business until I come." So we refuse to give up. Quit is not in our vocabulary. We don't throw in the towel. We keep proclaiming good news because we believe a better day is just ahead. Why is that? Because God is causing all things to work together for good to those who love him and are called according to a purpose. I want to end with this story. Alexander Solzhenitsyn was the great Russian dissident. And because of his vocalness concerning the totalitarian regime of the old Soviet Union, he was thrown into the Gulag. And the Gulag was an incredibly terrible place to be. And it was on one particular day that he was assigned the job of digging a ditch. He'd been there for years. Digging ditches were common. It was a futile activity. They weren't used for anything. It was simply to keep them busy. And the day had arrived when Solzhenitsyn decided that he was done digging ditches. And so he threw his shovel down and he walked over to a wooden bench and he sat down, knowing full well that if the Russian guard saw him walk away from his ditch digging, that guard would pick up the shovel and probably beat him to death with it. But it was while he was sitting there that an old man shuffled up to him. And while Solzhenitsyn was sitting at the bench, the old man began to etch out in the dirt at his feet below the image of the cross. And at that particular moment, as he hunched over and he drew the sign of the cross, something happened to Solzhenitsyn. He writes that his entire perspective shifted. He understood the odds. He understood the futility of where he was at and what he was doing. He understood his frustration, the desire to throw in the towel, to quit, to give up, because the odds against this Soviet empire seemed insurmountable. But yet as his eyes dropped to that simple picture of a cross and the power that it represented, he was reminded at that moment that anything is possible with God. And with that, he picked up his shovel. He went back to ditch digging, and through providence, paradox, and perseverance, he was eventually released from that gulag and became the voice to the world concerning Soviet totalitarianism, and in no small part, aided to its collapse. It was Isaac Watts who once said, at the cross where I first saw the light, and the burden of my heart rolled away. It was there by faith I received my sight. and now I am happy all the day.
Thanks for listening to the Pinnacle Leaders Podcast. This show can be found on Apple Podcasts, cpnshows.com, or wherever you listen to podcasts. If you have suggestions for this show, we'd love to know what you think. Visit www.randalllangley.com to share your thoughts or connect with me on social media. You can also find other resources and interviews with my previous guests on my website, Facebook, and Instagram. We exist to serve kingdom-minded leaders like you. Grace and peace, my friends.